They fit and everything.
Ladies and gentlemen, does we have your attention? No. Why? Start. Can you hear me at the back all right?
Yes. No.
Good, good. No? Who said no? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start now because, as we're probably aware, we've got to get for lunch by 1:30 at the Hilton in Park Lane. First of all, thank you very much for being with us here today. Welcome to the Hilton BBC Television Centre. For some of you, of course, it's welcome again because you were with us 18 months ago when we unveiled our first 4 plaques over there. Today we add 8 great names to the list of people who have been involved in great BBC television comedy. I'd like to take this opportunity first of all to thank the BBC for their support in this project. I'd also like to thank BBC Worldwide, who once again very kindly sponsored the plaques. And above all, I would like to thank Harold Snoad for all his hard work in the negotiations and putting together this project. I've just been asked if we've got a list of who's doing what. I hope we have, or we're going to be here all night. Ladies and gentlemen, I think as we have a lot to get through, I will now finish. I would just like to come back to Harold and say that he has been a tremendous friend to comic heritage, and above all else, of course, he has been long associated with the BBC as a producer and director and has worked with all the greats of television comedy. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Snoad.
Thank you, David. Before I start, David has already mentioned the fact that the BBC has been very helpful about this, and I think I just ought to mention just a couple of people who specifically back me up my mad as a sort of go-between between comic heritage and the BBC. Will Wyatt, who's been very supportive of this as managing director of television, and indeed Margaret Salmon, the chief executive for Resources, who's labelled this on. And I'd also like to mention Carol Sterling, and those two I mentioned before, right at the top of the ladder. Carol Sterling is just a shade further down, in charge of the facilities here, and Howard Hayes, who's responsible for the unit, to make sure that you've got from the right place here from A to B. And thank you again, because anybody lost it, his fault. So let's move on to the actual unveilings. Incidentally, if I don't dwell on the theatre and film careers of the people we're honouring, then please understand it's not because we're disinterested or anything like that, but these are plaques to people who have particularly made a big big deal of television comedy, so we're going to stick to that side of their lives to a great extent. Now we're going to start with a plaque to the much loved Arthur Lowe. Arthur didn't start out with the intention of being an actor. It was whilst he was serving as a sergeant major in the Second World War that he first tried his hand at dramatics, and thank goodness for us that he did. He had a very successful theatre career, including West End musicals and national theatre productions. His first venture into BBC comedy was when he starred alongside Richard Briers in 7 of the Ben Travers farces, and his last comedy series was Potter, but of course he will always be remembered for the stuff in between, which is wonderful performances of Captain Mannering in Dad's Army. As we all know, the show was a huge success, and it still is 30 years later. I worked on the show for the first 5 series, directed some of the episodes, and co-adapted nearly 70 of them for radio, so I had the great pleasure of getting to know Arthur very well. Regrettably, a number of the cast are now, to use show business parlance, appearing elsewhere, but the plaque to Arthur is going to be unveiled by those members of the Dad's Army team who are, thankfully, still available. So, could we have these forward? Clive Dunn, Lavender, Bill, I don't think is here, is he, from Pertwee? Frank Williams? You can move faster than that. Wonderful episode. And of course, Jimmy Perry. I gather that David isn't able to be here, but Jimmy is. So it's the first plaque here. Don't unveil the wrong one, folks. On the left. So we'll get together in a nice group and work out how you're going to do this.
Can you all smile at the camera first of all, before you pull anything, just look at your face, fine. Smiling, everybody? Right, tell it when you like. This is the smile.
Okay, Clive, go.
Sorry, just come
One, two, three.
What is it?
1, 2, 3, pull!
Windscreen's a bit lucky this time.
Thanks. So, don't go too far, folks, because we're going to, the next plaque is going to, oh, thank you very much. That's it, too close. Will of its own, that's it. Can't get stuff up there. Oh, don't mind. Which is for almost 50 years. He made more than 100 films, generally in comedy roles, but if I listed them all, we'd never get to the Hilton. He appeared in Hancock's Half Hour and Hancock, and the ITV series George the Dragon, but he will always be remembered for playing Sergeant Wilson in 9 Years of Dad's Army. He was a lovely man, very laid back, and it has to be said, not terribly practical. There was an episode I remember that we did of Dad's Army in which Pike is in a bog, and everybody in the platoon had to help get him out, but it was deliberately written so that John didn't, and he was caught up in some barbed wire because we just knew that he wasn't very practical. And I remember having a similar incident, to tell the story quite quickly, when I was using him in a Dick Emery show, and I was rehearsing a film sequence which I was directing, and he was required to point a pistol at Dick during a half page of dialogue, and had to ask him to hand over an expensive ring. And at this point John stopped and said to me, "How am I going to take it from him? I'm holding this pistol." And I pointed out that he could use his other hand, and he looked down at the hand in question and said, oh yes, of course, yeah. John also starred in a radio series that I co-wrote called It Sticks Out Half a Mile, and in fact there were already plans to make a second batch when he sadly died, just 3 days after the first series was transmitted. So the same people who unveiled the plaque to Arthur are going to do this one, except they're going to be joined by Joan, John's widow. I didn't put them up. Thank you very much. I've been doing this for a long time.
Yes, I saw.
Yes, it is.
That's good advice.
He doesn't trust us. Oh, Bill, I'm sorry. Well, come to the photograph. When did you get it?
Stand in front of me as you usually do. Come here, Billy.
If you could just have yeah, everyone's smiling. Smile at camera, please. Jimmy.
Get out of here alive.
Stay there for this chap.
Right, our next plaque is to Harry Worth. Now, like Arthur Lowe, Harry gained his early show business experience whilst in the forces and subsequently appeared at the Windmill Theatre doing a ventriloquist act. He made his debut as a stand-up comic on the Newcastle Empire. It's a very funny, clumsy, bungling routine, for which we fondly remember him, came about quite accidentally as a result of his nerves getting the better of him on that night. Later, he was doing a very successful radio series in Manchester, when the producer decided quite rightly that Harry also had enormous visual potential and made a one-off television show. This inspired the powers that be, and as a result, BBC viewers saw a series called The Trouble with Harry, then 7 series of another show called Here's Harry, both of these shows directed by the aforementioned producer, and a further series called Harry Worth. And it should be the one on the right.
Here we go.
Here now to our last. The first one of those is going to be to Tony Hancock. About Tony Hancock, he was absolutely wonderful. He worked in the Windmill, he appeared in the West End in a couple of very good reviews, a variety band box he was on. But I suppose really his career really took over when he met up with Galton and Simpson. And we got into the radio series of Hancock's Half Hour, and then onto the television series. And they were absolutely wonderful. There were 100 radio episodes and 6 series, 58 episodes of the television show. I have fond memories of working on some of those down at Riverside Studios. So the plaque to Tony Hancock is going to be unveiled, obviously, by Galton and Alan Simpson, who wrote those brilliant scripts, and by June Whitfield, Frank Thornton, Lis Fraser, and Graham Stark, all of whom worked with Tony. And what about Alec Bragonzi, who also worked with Tony? Yes? It's this one here. Hold on. So, you've got Ray and Alan? No Ray, no Alan. What's that like? It's not the first time we're getting That's all right, no, it's fine. Well, I heard you. Come on.
Yes, yeah. I did do
20. They find a stage show as the feed to the resident comic, who turned out to be Ernie. Later they worked together on various radio series, but it was in 1961 that they were first seen on TV. They subsequently switched to the BBC, where they made 9 series of the Morecambe and Wise show, which, as we all know, was incredibly popular. It'll be a very long time, if ever, before we see such a talented and popular comedy duo. I'm going to hand over now to the producer of their last series, who was also the man who devised and choreographed a number of their routines over the years, Ernie Sachs.
I love them. I've said this before and I'll say it again. As long as there's a cinema screen, they will always be Laurel and Hardy. But as long as there's a television screen, I'm sure you'll agree with me, there will always be Morecambe and Wise. Now, I don't want to be up here and talk for a long time because the stars are Eric and Ernie. And I would like to introduce Joan Morecambe and Doreen Wise to come up here, the wives of Eric and Ernie. Do your lovely curtsies, please. Oh, that's right. And also, a lovely person who Jean Kelly should have used her, you know, she was great. So now we will open. Where? Right, so Eric's is which one? This one? So Angela.
Do your step first of all. Do your step first of all. One at a time. Right, listen, do your step. Do your step. What? No, it's you don't want to do it. One, two, three,
We're now retiring back to the Hilton on Park Lane. Those of you that are down for the coaches.